All right, everyone, good morning. We will be starting out with the whole discussion around the constitutional scheme of taxation in our country. The first two classes we had spent trying to engage with certain normative questions around taxation regimes. And now is the time that we get very efficient and start looking into all those kinds of issues which are closer home, closer to the practical aspects of taxation and the way in which this kind of interplay operates. Um, Having put across that taxation is worked out as a part of this whole social contract, it is across the countries and across regimes a given that taxing powers is an inherent power of the sovereign, right? And yet, when these powers are to be exercised, it is not that they will remain completely unfettered. You do have certain kinds of, frameworks which are being put out within which these powers are to be exercised. Uh, in the next few classes from now on, that is what we will be very closely examining as to one, what exactly is the scheme of taxation in our constitution and how exactly does this kind of a counterbalance work in the sense that you do not have this demonic powers to unleash taxes on your citizenry. um, First things first, a very bare bone kind of a informational which will be provided in the next few in the next few slides which follow. This is merely setting out the bare provisions for ourselves just to then start engaging with what we have put out. Article 366, Clause 28 essentially sets out to define what exactly we mean by taxation. It does comprise range of other definitions as well. We'll just see it. Taxation includes the imposition of any tax or impost, whether general or local or special, and tax shall be construed accordingly, right? So we see that there is per se no theoretical definition which we are finding within the constitution. It is giving us this very vague sort of an idea, so to say, that all right, what we mean by taxation, it includes, right? So this is an inclusive kind of definition which has been put in place. And these kinds of imposts which are being referred to could be general, it could be local in nature, or it could also be special, right? So your earmarked taxes are also taken care of in this kind of a definitional conceptualizing. Uh, Essentially, even as we recognize that tax is an inherent power of a sovereign, Can you hear me? Okay, right, right. Okay, right. Okay, yeah. So, essentially, 265 is putting across this kind of a requisite that for anyone to be imposing the tax, one would require that backing of law, and you cannot start imposing taxes merely by passing this kind of by passing any kind of an executive fiat. Uh, what will this in practical sense of terms means? We will also take a look at it as we proceed further. 245 is what provides us with the extent of the laws made by the parliament and those by the legislatures, right? So um, it essentially is under 245 giving us the geographical kind of an extent of the application of even the taxing laws, right? And especially when you read clause number 2, which says no law made by parliament shall be deemed to be invalid on the ground that it would have extraterritorial operations, right? This would also essentially mean that if there are consequences for our jurisdiction, then the fact that your law will have extraterritorial operations will not be a ground to declare them as invalid. A range of tax related consequences, right? So two parties entering into those agreements outside India, when they have their implications on India, it can't be that the income tax law do not apply to them, right? And consequently, one will be extending the income tax law even to those kinds of transactions which will happen. 246 is the bedrock of the federal setup that we have. I'm sure you would have already or you will be studying this in greater details in the constitutional law course. And yet, for the purposes of tax, we very simplistically understand 246 as creating this kind of demarcation of not only the legislative powers, but also the taxing powers between the center and the state, right? So the crux of 246, if one was to very simplistically understand, anything which is contained in list 1, including the general entries and taxing entries, parliament has the exclusive power to make laws. Anything which is in list 2, state legislatures will have this kind of a power. There are no taxing entries insofar as concurrent list is concerned, right? So we are very clear that when it comes to taxes, we do not want this kind of an overlap, right? So of course, in terms of theory, they have very clearly demarcated and there exists a watertight compartmentalization. But as we proceed further, we will see that this division is not as neat as it appears to be. And even when it comes to taxing matters, there has been a whole lot of back and forth and tussle of who has this kind of a power to tax that specific base or that specific, assessee or that person or subject matter has, often been coming to the courts. Mind you, this is the situation even after GST has been put in place, right? So, even with GST being put into place, where we are saying that both the center and the states will have dual concurrent powers to impose GST, the entry related to GST is not found in the concurrent list, right? So that is something which is being put across. Yes, you do have Article 246A, which has been giving this kind of special provision with respect to GST, and yet there is no accompanying taxing entry in the seventh schedule, which is comprising of all these lists. See, as it is, we do understand that double taxes should be avoided, and yet there is nothing in the constitution which we find as a express kind of a restriction on this kind of double taxation, right? So Whereas for all practical sense of terms, or even in terms of the canons of taxation which the economists and the theorists put across, taxing someone twice, is something which should be frowned upon. But we do not have any some such kind of an embargo within the constitution which does not allow it to happen, right? So that is also something which needs to be kept in the background. Residuary powers of legislation making. Now here there is this kind of a difference being made, in the sense that after coming into force of GST and the insertion of Article 246A, the difference which is being made is that when it comes to the residuary powers, in terms of making any laws with respect to GST, in that parliament shall not have exclusive power, right? Because this residuary power is now subjected to Article 246A, which is referring to that GST related, legislation making. So, whereas your other fields and other, general entries is for what Parliament continues to have exclusive powers. This is something which has been carved out, right? When it comes to GST, there is this kind of a exclusion which has been made. These are the range of other definitions only for your general information purposes. We are not engaging into each of this at this juncture. The list which is before you is again an indicative kind of a list. The crossed out paragraphs that you are seeing are the changes in the entries which had been put in place after GST was enrolled. Uh, Now, herein you do see all these kinds of taxing entries which have been given to the central government, right? So the very first entry which you are seeing, entry number 82, taxes on income other than agricultural income, right? Now, this is the entry when read with Article 246 is what gives the central government this power to impose income tax, right? Similarly, entry number 83, duties of customs, including export duties, right? So this is how you are reading the article along with the requisite entry. Sometimes what you may find is that you can also combine the two entries and then read them alongside that article, right? So sometimes, given the kind of the tax which is being imposed, one can have multiple entries being read in conjunction with each other, and then one can one derives that kind of authority to impose that tax. Do remember that taxing entries on their own do not confer any power. This is something which is very foundational. They are there as merely to facilitate this kind of division of taxing powers, but the taxing entries in these lists in themselves do not confer that power. They have to be read with the necessary article from the constitution, and that's when the tax can be rolled out. Number of all these kinds of entries which you are seeing, right? These are all exclusively taxing entries which are out here. Taxes on services. This entry 92C was very much, within the constitution, yet it was never being made effective, right? So we did have service tax regime being imposed in the country, but that was via entry 97, which is the residuary entry, and not under 92C, right? And now that you've put in GST, there was no requirement of this entry, so they have now scrapped it, right? All these crossed out entries are the ones which have been scrapped out, and either they have been replaced with the new entries, or they have been taken off the book altogether. Similarly, you have all these kinds of state list, land revenues, taxes on agricultural income, taxes on lands and buildings, right? So on and so forth. Now, um, Yes, when you are trying to understand from where is this kind of a taxing power being derived by this authority, you have to read Article 246 along with the taxing entry, right? That's the way in which you will construe it. Now, see, despite this presumption being made that tax is imposed by a legislature in public interest, it is not that this presumption cannot be challenged. A law which is imposing a tax is therefore not immune from constitutional challenge, and there are restraints which have been put on the taxing powers of the governments in our country. Primarily, these constitutional restraints are to be read in these three broad categorizations, so that whenever one is trying to assail the imposition of any tax, one can challenge the taxing legislation in any of the following, mm, strategy that you might want to have. Number one, competence of the legislature. Second, guarantees of the fundamental freedoms. And third, are the other constitutional limitations, right? Let me just first come to the competence of the legislature. Any taxing legislation will have to be, as I was just referring a few seconds ago, will have to be reading its power, which is comprised in the Constitution, read with the relevant taxing entry. The moment you find that the, the government which is imposing that tax is not having that requisite taxing entry with it, you can very well challenge that the legislation did not have the competence to the government, that specific government did not have the competence to impose that levy. Um, Let me give you that example of, you remember a couple of years ago you had that Krishi Kalyan cess. Now, when you say that it was a cess that was imposed by the central government, and you find that when it comes to agriculture, it is a state matter, right? How is it that the central government is imposing a cess with respect to that kind of a subject matter? One can bring in this kind of questions to the competence of the legislature. Even in terms of alongside with it, you remember we all were paying that the Swachh Bharat cess. Now that was also a cess which was imposed by the central government. If you look at list 2, hygiene, health, all those kinds of subject matters are the ones which have been assigned to the state governments, right? So then how is it that the central government is collecting this kind of a cess from all of us on a subject matter which has been specifically been assigned to the state governments, right? These are the kinds of questions which one should be asking the moment one is dealing with this kind of a taxing statutes. Um, of course, the burden to prove that this is outside the competence of that specific legislature is on the one who is assailing the competence of it. And consequently, one will have to read the text very, very closely. That's one. Second, apart from this kind of a competence part, taxing statutes can also be subjected to scrutiny of Part 3 of the Constitution. And in case they are found to be violating the freedoms which are guaranteed under the chapter on the fundamental rights, one can get those kinds of laws declared as violative of the Constitution and hence void. However, important point to be remembered in here is, because taxing statutes are falling within those realms of economic policy making, there is a lot of technical kind of things which have been going around. a lot of latitude is given to the governments when it comes to taxing statutes, right? So the rigors of this kind of an assessment when it comes to fundamental rights vis-a-vis taxing statutes is is less, is it is relatively less, right? So you do not find the courts very quickly jumping into this kind of an arena to say that all right, the moment there is this kind of a challenge, they will be, very, willing to, quickly deliver and, hold all of these kinds of statutes as void. Because we do have an understanding, and in fact, we will also come through those cases where the courts have been saying that, look, this is within the legislative wisdom in order to say that fine if they would want to impose so and so tax, right? So the fact that it is causing hardship to someone, the fact that it is creating this kind of a differentia, or it is not taxing everybody, is no grounds to say that it is violating someone's fundamental rights. We will pick examples even in here as to when there were these kinds of statutes that were even struck down, but otherwise the examples are not too many. Lastly, constitutional limitations, which are comprised in part 13 of the Constitution, which is that by virtue of imposing taxes, you can't be creating those kinds of trade barriers, right? Part 13 of the Constitution, which guarantees that the trade, commerce, and intercourse within the country will be free, right? That is something which has at times been read to say that state governments or even otherwise even central government, you cannot be using taxes to curtail that kind of a freedom, right? So that again is an area which I presume you will study in greater details in your constitutional law portion, because if we start dealing with this third point in the taxing course, we will be trenching a lot on the constitutional law aspects of it, and that's something which any which ways you will study in con law. So it's better that we don't have overlaps between the two. So let me come to the first part of this, which is the competence of the legislature. This is a very interesting part. Even those of you who might want to litigate in future, or constitutional law is something which, like most law people, fascinates you, and you would want to have some kind of inter an interdisciplinary kind of study, so to say, between constitutional law and taxation. This is your go-to area. Quite many legal luminaries have been practicing in this area. A lot of cases, lot of interesting developments in here, which has, and in fact, a lot of jurisprudence available in so far as this portion is concerned. The case which, again, I'm sure you will cover in your constitutional law. However, this is something which is way more important for a tax course also to leave out or to ignore, is the case of Union of India versus H.S. Dhillon. This is a 1972 ruling of the Supreme Court, and this is exactly where that whole interplay between tax and constitution law comes through very, very clearly. Also gives us a good grounding and solid foundations in how do we deal with taxes in our system. Uh, this case is basically about wealth tax. Wealth tax in the current times has already been abolished a couple of years ago. This was basically a tax imposed way back in 1957 on what we can conveniently identify as high net worth individuals. Of course, over the period of time, it was realized that the government was spending much more, and the administrative costs of running that whole wealth tax regime was coming much high than the kind of collections that they were making. So they folded this up and then they imposed, additional kinds of taxes under the income tax slab. But this is the case with which we will engage with. Now, under the Wealth Tax Act, what they essentially used to do is this was a act which was framed by the central government, and the wealth tax was collected by the central government. What was being taxed was the value of all the assets of an assessee which were found to be in excess of his debts. The tax was an annual tax based on the net worth of an individual. How was this net worth to be found? Simple terms, assets minus his debts, right? Now, this is something which is other than your income tax, right? Your personal income. This is the wealth which is forming the base of it. Now, herein, therefore, the aggregation of all the assets of an assessee would happen at whichever place they were located, minus the aggregate value of the debts which were being owed by that specific individual. And that's how the tax was being imposed. Now, there was this kind of a challenge on the competence of the central government to impose this kind of a wealth tax by this particular individual, Sudhir Chandra Navan, 1969, a Supreme Court ruling, wherein it is being asked that under what entry is the wealth tax being imposed? Because according to the entries which we had seen, we were just very quickly glancing through it. Now that's when we start focusing on these. Entry 49 in list 2 is about taxes on lands and buildings. Entry 86 of list 1 is taxes on the capital value of the assets, exclusive of agricultural land of individuals and companies, taxes on the capital of companies, right? So you do have zeroed in on these two likely entries. One entry 49 of list 2, one entry 86 of list 1. And the question is that if this is how you have framed the wealth tax, all assets minus all the liabilities, under what entry is the central government trying to tax it? Because you are not finding anything very specific in terms of the taxing entries. Now, the argument which this assessee was making, right? Because the person was trying to assail the competence of the central government to impose wealth tax, was to say that, see, net wealth is including all these kinds of assets, which will be including all the lands and buildings also that any assessee might possess. But then the power to levy tax on lands and buildings has been granted to the state legislatures by entry 49. So consequently, Parliament should be held as incompetent to levy wealth tax on the capital value of the assets, including lands and buildings, right? So you have this entry, mind you, and this is the framework within which it was suggested that the central government is bound to operate itself. Now, this is where the Supreme Court rejected this argument to say that, see, when one is imposing a wealth tax on an assessee, it is not being taxed on that land and building. It is something which is, taxed on the capital value of the assets after aggregation. And consequently, the tax which is imposed under wealth tax is not on the component of the assets, but it is imposed on the totality of the assets which the assessee owns, and therefore these two are separate kinds of fields. What the state government is imposing is on the on that component of land and building. What the central government is imposing is on the totality of it. Are we okay with this? Are we okay with this kind of a reading? Is it making sense to you? Okay. Why would anyone have an objection if this is really not making sense? Like, what kind of
Ma'am,
reservations would you have? Yeah.
ma'am, because see, the problem with this kind of reading is that even if the central government is charging on the totality of it, it has already been included in the state list, and the state government has taxed the person on the same, right?
Hmm,
If I'm
hmm.
getting it correct.
Right,
So
right. So,
again, it's going in a double taxation kind of thing.
right, right, right. There are other comments also in the chat box which are taking that similar line, that this is not really as clear a kind of a segregation, because after all, aren't you like, taxing that particular item twice, right? So that first the state governments, each state government will tax them, and then later on the central government will also tax it, right? Now, this exactly is the point which I was making a little while ago, that although we do have theoretically this very watertight compartmentalization, it is not as tight as we thought it might be, right? So there are these kinds of, some kind of a fluidity between the two. And to say that, fine, this is what the Supreme Court landed up stating, that look, these are apparently two different things. It's like when an individual will have land or building in the state of Rajasthan, Telangana, or maybe even Kerala. Each of those state governments will tax that person. Now, when they will be taxing the lands and buildings, right? They will not take into account any debts which you are owning. Whereas when the central government is stepping in by the virtue of this wealth tax, it is aggregating all these lands and buildings situated and within the ownership of this individual, owned in Rajasthan, Telangana, and Kerala. It is aggregating it minus the debts which are there, and now we are imposing it, which means that this has become altogether a different subject matter, hmm, which is not covered by the state legislature. Hmm. The fact that there is some overlap is something which is an overlap only in law, not in the terms of the exact subject matter per se, right? So this sailed through. Now, this doesn't end here. Just hold on. Which is now the main controversy to which we are coming, the HS Dillon one. Um, yeah, just a moment. Yeah, right. So the Sudhir Navan's case was giving you this bottom line, that wealth tax is an annual tax imposed on the net value of all the assets minus all the liabilities, and that the nature of wealth tax is different from the tax which the state governments are imposing under entry 49. Now, look at this. We have on this presumption, the Supreme Court and Sudhir Chandra Navan upheld the validity of the Wealth Tax Act, uh, and consequently, therefore, this tax sustained in the system. Sometime in the year 1969, an amendment was made into this act, whereby now value of agricultural land was also made inclusive in the calculation of the net wealth, right? So you had first left out the agricultural land from those lands and buildings that you were computing. This time around, you also started valuing the agricultural land for the purposes of net wealth. Now, this is where the petition from H.S. Dillon was launched to say that look at the entries under which you are putting this kind of a tax. Entry 49 was always there, taxes on lands and buildings given to the state governments. Even if you were, by Sudhir Chandra Navan's decisions, let's say, were proceeding on this presumption that it is entry 86, entry 86 itself says taxes on the capital value of the assets exclusive of agricultural land of individuals and companies, right? So then how is it now that something which has been expressly been put across in entry 86, how can the central government include it by virtue of this kind of an amendment? The central government, however, was trying to take refuge under entry 97. Remember, that is the residuary entry that we have under list 1 in the schedule 7, which says any other matter not included in list 2, list 3, and any tax not mentioned in list 2 and 3, right? So they are saying that by virtue of entry 97, which is the residuary entry, and when it is read with that residuary power which vests in the parliament, together with the reading of these entries, entry 86 and 246, entry 97 and 248, the central government is defending that no, we do have that power because this kind of a tax on this kind of a wealth of this kind of aggregation that we are doing is nowhere found. So we are combining 86 with 97. That is also something which is a kind of a resort which one could have. The petition of H.S. Dillon had first been filed before the High Court of Punjab, and they had, as I just referred, challenged that this is in fact now, trying to tax the agricultural land, which has been assigned exclusively, right? Agriculture as a subject matter has been assigned to the state governments. And now that you are including the lands which are also agricultural lands, this is beyond the scope. That the parliament cannot have this kind of a competence, and hence, to this extent, this amendment has to be struck down. The petition was heard by the full bench of the High Court, and by majority of 4:1, they allowed this petition, holding that the amendment, to the extent that it included agricultural land, within how you are defining the assets, was ultra vires, the constitution, right? So you are not striking down the whole act, but only that part of the amendment which is found to be, beyond that kind of a scoping which has happened. The matter therefore reached the Supreme Court, and that is the case which is considered as a landmark. I'm sure if you all have been reading around, even when recently, the laws on the agricultural, subject matter, which was put across by the central government, this was one of the cases which was cited very frequently, right? That when it comes to agriculture, it is something which is a subject matter assigned to the state governments, right? So how can the central just walk in into those kinds of subject matters? Now, the fundamental issue which is put across before the Supreme Court in the H.S. Dillon's case is this. Number one, first to clarify which exactly is the entry under which wealth tax is being imposed, right? Because it had been in system way back since the 50s, and still there was like a lot of vagueness around it as to where exactly are you making yourself fall. Whether the tax is under entry 49 of state list, if it is, then the central government can't impose it. Is it under entry 86? If yes, then what about that exclusion which has happened? Because 86 in itself is carving out this kind of an agricultural land. Wouldn't it therefore constitute a positive prohibition on the parliament, right? That the entry on which you are relying in itself is setting aside that subject matter. Then can you drag that subject matter back by virtue of reading entry 97? And of course, the last fallback is that if it is neither 49 nor 86, then does it fall under entry 97, right? Because then that would have been the end of the matter. Your residuary entry doesn't fall either in state list, and consequently, it would have come to the, the residuary powers of the parliament. So this is something which is the critical question. Now, the arguments which are being made on behalf of the Union of India was that this is not with respect to entry 49. In fact, they are saying that they haven't entrenched upon any of the subject matters in list 2. So Union of India is saying that this is something which is not 49. They are clear about it. कि 49 to nahi hai. Then they are asking that, all right, as parliament, we have the legislative competence to pass this kind of a law under entry 86 read with 97, or totally under entry 97 read with the relevant article 248. These words, according to the parliament, exclusive of agricultural land, right? Because they were very much inscribed in your face in entry 86, is not to be read so as to cut down their scope under entry 97, right? So what is the stance taken by the parliament? They are saying, we are very clear, this is not 49. Under what entries are they reading it? They are saying 86 read with 97. And even if 86 is making that exclusion doesn't mean that it can't be getting a entry, or its kind of inclusion by virtue of 97. So they are saying that it can't, these words exclusive of agricultural land in entry 86 cannot act as a positive prohibition to then include something in entry 97 if they don't find anything in list 2. The arguments for the respondents was that you see consistently what has been the scheme of the demarcation of legislative powers as well as the taxing powers. Whenever anything is pertaining to agriculture, it has been straight away been assigned to the state governments. Look at all these entries they are saying in list 2. Taxes on agricultural income, duties in respect of succession to agricultural land, estate duty in respect of agricultural land, taxes on lands and buildings, right? This, according to the argument of the respondents in this case, are saying that, look, anything pertaining to agriculture straight away goes to the state government. And if it has been given to the state governments, Parliament cannot give it a backdoor entry by virtue of 97. Are we okay with this? Now, this is something which has to be therefore decided whether these words exclusive of agricultural land, how do we construe it? See, when we make these comparisons, right, and that's what you will find even in this judgment. It's a very longish judgment as it is, but I'm just bringing you the core. The moment those comparatives were made, right, Supreme Court began to find is that when anything was excluded from list 1, it got included in list 2. For example, when you said taxes on income other than agricultural income, you found a corresponding entry in list 2 which said taxes on agricultural income. Just a moment. I would request everyone to mute yourself. I'm hearing some background. Just a moment. Okay. Right. So what Supreme Court goes on to observe is that, see, every time there is something which is excluded from list 1, it has gotten included in list 2. Taxes on income other than agricultural income, gets included as taxes on agricultural income in list 2. Duties of excise on tobacco and other goods manufactured except alcoholic liquor for human consumption, etc. You will find a corresponding entry, duties of excise on alcoholic liquors given to the state government. Estate duty in respect of property other than agricultural land, you find an entry in list 2, estate duty in respect of agricultural land. Now, this is where it found that when we came to entry 86, once the entry had excluded the agricultural lands from 86, it did not find any corresponding entry in list 2. So there was this kind of a gap in which this particular subject matter fell, right? So for everything that you excluded got included in list 2, excepting for this particular item which was being referred to, right? And this became a very critical turning point, so to say, when this matter was therefore being heard. Uh, right, so, okay. I think let's just stop here, because if I proceed from this point, we will run into your break time. So just keep this particular comparative on the mind. When we continue tomorrow, we will continue from this particular point. I'm really sorry to break the session at this juncture, but we would have been extending it too much if we proceeded, right? We'll continue from this when we meet tomorrow.